Hello and welcome to my talk at DEF CON 30 Biohacking Village. Today I'll be speaking to the problem set of reframing the cybersecurity conversation, and I'll talk shortly about what that means in practice. But for now, I'm going to leave you with a quick problem to noodle. In the airline industry, when there's ever an event with an aircraft, you're often advised to put your own oxygen mask on first before tending to others. So I want you to think about what that means and when you're dealing with cybersecurity as a cultural challenge in a corporation, but also as an individual challenge to combat burnout and fatigue. So moving on, a quick introduction to myself. That's my pre-COVID photo. Please don't make too much fun, but I've been working in healthcare and academia for a couple of decades in a cybersecurity capacity. I'm very lucky to work in healthcare, and today what we're going to be talking about, the problem that I'm going to present, about 25-30 minutes of content, so sit back and enjoy. I'll first define a little bit more detail on what I see as an issue with the current framing for cybersecurity, and then I'll talk about a proposed solution, and then present particular strategies that you can adopt to help change the culture from a cybersecurity perspective at your organization, and indeed some similar strategies that might help you as a security practitioner with some of your wellness and mental health. Quick disclaimer. These opinions and these thoughts and these strategies presented here today are based upon my thoughts, my opinions. They do not reflect on my employer, nor indeed do they reflect necessarily on DEF CON or the Biohacking Village. This is obviously a slide that replicates some of the content from Jackass, the comedy series. And, like Jackass, I think we all owe a tremendous thank you to healthcare, the industry that I work with. And, healthcare has helped Johnny Knoxville and his team overcome some challenges, but also the last few years have been pretty tough on healthcare. We've had to weather the dual pandemics of COVID-19 and a massive uptick in ransomware. And, I couldn't be more thankful, and it's truly an honor to work with my clinical colleagues and my IT and InfoSec colleagues in healthcare. So let's revisit this noodle that I presented to you. So last year I attended a very interesting talk at DEF CON on behaviorism and a lot of content on Robert Sapolsky. And, it led me to this kind of decision that, if you look at systems thinking, you look at design thinking, there's kind of an overarching philosophy that structure influences behavior. What is external is often a reflection of what is internal. So, I aligned to a statement from an Irish poet, Seamus Heaney, that there is risk and truth to yourselves and the world before you. It really resonated with me that it was probably time to rethink some of the approach to cybersecurity, in particular around using the analogies of conflict and combat. I'll talk about it shortly, but also to apply some of that wellness prerogatives and kind of being open and willing to change. So, what does it mean to think about cybersecurity in a mindful context? And, to apply some of that tenets from not just Seamus Heaney, but maybe Walt Whitman, that there's better to be curious than it is to be judgmental. So, if I move on to this philosophy of thinking in cybersecurity in terms of conflict and kind of continuous combat, it's a ripe metaphor. It directly relates to things like chains of command, or indeed uncertainty around fogs of war. It applies to the continual need to invest. It also applies to the need to develop weaponry and maintain an arsenal. There's a lot to be said for using combat metaphors, but by that same measure, there are some detractions. So if you look at some of the operating theaters that we deal with around endpoint hygiene or identity or application security. All of these separate silos would require a significant investments. And, there's an argument to be made that using the combat metaphor of binary thinking, win and lose, perhaps we've lost some of these battles. Perhaps we're more focused on the war and, the changing nature of warfare itself, perhaps in this day and age becoming more espionage driven. Unfortunately, there's no Geneva Convention. There's no way to overcome some of these obstacles that military thinking can bring to the table. This consummate fear of failure, this need to be right 100% of the time. It can lead to a distorted cognition. It can lead to a siege mentality when all you're able to do is build bunkers. Does it lead to some kind of conversation around overcoming some of these obstacles? Perhaps there's a better way to think about these. Even the very nature of warfare, as I mentioned, is starting to change right now. AI and drones and smart technology is starting to overwhelm the traditional mechanisms. So, if we apply even some of that thinking to modern healthcare or cybersecurity in particular, perhaps it's time to reframe the conversation. So there's lots of different analogies that are available. I had a quick conversation with Sunil Yu recently around his cyber defense matrix, and he had an interesting analogy around herd cattle and pets. These different religious animals that we tend to hold sacred. But you can also think about divination or fortune telling. I've always been asked by every board and senior leader the simple question, are we secure? And it's very hard to predict the future. I don't have a crystal ball. I don't have a hotline to Mystic Meg or Madam Cleo. You really have to do a forensics or archaeology exercise to look at what happened in the past and use that to at least represent what may happen in the future. As much as this is Nostradamus right here, there's also an analogy around spirituality. There's the thinking of forgiveness and the need for adhering to a particular code of behavior. There's the concept of sin and indeed sins of omission and sins of commission. There's also the concept of the Spanish Inquisition or religious wars or false prophets and blasphemy. They sometimes have an analogy in cybersecurity. But to move this conversation and presentation forward, I'd like you to present or to think about the serenity prayer. You're granted this serenity to accept the things you cannot change, the courage to change the things you can, and the wisdom to know the difference. That's very, very much driven by wellness. There's also the analogy that applies directly to healthcare, that you are recommended to physician heal thyself. So before you attempt to correct others, first look to make sure you aren't guilty of the same faults. So, spirituality and religion has a direct analogy in framing some of the cybersecurity conversation. There's lots of other analogies. Sports is a big one. You can talk about team playing and other kinds of things. You can also indeed, as I stated, I work in healthcare. So there's healthcare analogies. So when you think of it in the healthcare space, you can talk about surgical operations. You can talk about prescription medications. You can talk about the concept of an ER or indeed cyber rehab. You can, around the prescription space, maybe you start thinking about things like cyber Narcan. Might apply to some of our colleagues in the forensics and the IR space. But inherently, what I'm here to talk about today is thinking or reframing the conversation around cybersecurity in therapeutic terms. What does it mean to have a 12-step program for your organization? And what does that mean also for you as a practitioner? When you think about these coping strategies, these skills that several therapeutic practices like mindfulness or dialectical behavioral therapy or acceptance and commitment therapy. When you're thinking about distress tolerance or you're thinking about self-care, how does that apply around cybersecurity when, at least if you look at what's occurred over the last couple of years, the patient being the corporation, something that SCOTUS recommends we think of corporations as an entity or an individual, perhaps we can think of that individual as having poor hygiene. They've had some self-destructive behaviors entailing repeated visits to the ER. Perhaps they're addicted to absorbing risk and ignoring some of that guidance that the security practitioners and industry is trying to recommend. Maybe they're going through trauma, maybe there's some dysregulation or maladaptive coping strategies that they're applying based upon the delusion of control or the illusion of security that they perhaps can't adhere to. So that's the meat of what we'll be talking about here today. I'm about to speak to these therapeutic practices, and then I'll finish up with how they could potentially apply to help you change a corporation's culture, or indeed you as a practitioner. So let's introduce these therapeutic practices that I just mentioned. Where do they come from and what do they mean? So neuroscience and psychiatry and psychology is a storied discipline. It's, as a science, it's at least 300 years old, going back to René Descartes. But indeed, if you lose the analogy that I did earlier of spirituality, there's a lot that pulls from the Buddha or indeed Francis of Assisi or other kind of religious practitioners. So modern practice isn't necessarily this journey towards Freud and co. It's not, here's a MITRE attack graph. Please tell me where the bad CIO hurt you. It's a lot more evidence-based. It's a lot more outcome-driven. There's about 5 main families. We're going to focus on the third column here, cognitive behavioral therapy. It's at least about 100 years old. If you're coming from that military-industrial complex, or perhaps you're reading some of the headlines, you might be familiar with things like MK Ultra or the application of psychedelics or other kinds of things in a military complex for psychological operations or things of that nature. But we're here to talk about more towards the therapeutic practice. We're here more to talk about these behaviors that you can stem. It's not something that wasn't developed without some careful application of technology. And it's really measuring these outcomes. It's really the last 50 years or so have been about treating dysfunctions, and in doing so, how that careful application of therapeutic practice might self-soothe or address some of the underlying traumas. So the goal with CBT or cognitive behavioral therapy at a high level is to increase regulated behaviors through the careful application of coping skills. It's the detection of those early warning signs, and it's the identification of particular tried and tested coping skills that would help overcome those potential explosive situations. Again, it's evidence-based. It's the identification of unhelpful thoughts or cognitions, and it's the application of helpful and flexible behaviors to overcome unhelpful behaviors. There's about 3 main families that I'll address and pull from for the rest of the presentation. There's mindfulness behavioral therapy. It's something that's become very popular in a lot of circles. It's being mindful, it's being aware of particular cognitions, thoughts, and feelings. It's embracing, it's being open, it's being vulnerable. There's also dialectical behavioral therapy, which is, around being in the moment, being present, and, the identification of healthy behaviors, both ones that you can do and indeed surrounding yourself with parties who are positive and influencing your own behavior. There's also acceptance and commitment therapy, and this is really around the concept of radical acceptance and embracing the change that you need to implement, but also making sure that you're not avoiding some of these unhelpful behaviors. And what I'm going to do is take particular techniques from these three skills or families, and I'm going to walk you through potential application of those at a cultural engineering perspective, and with the goal not to become a kind of cultural hand grenade, but also to make sure that when you think of it in a systems thinking perspective, that structure influences behavior, that what's external, these toxins, these unregulated behaviors, these dysregulation, doesn't necessarily impact the practitioner. So you're overcoming some of the potential absorption of continually putting out fires. In general, what you're going to be taught is it's better to be effective than it is to be right. It's better to take concrete steps to apply these effective skills so that you're overcoming dysregulations like overgeneralization, magnifying problems into larger situations than actually are, that you're not diverting entirely to judgmental behavior or emotional reasoning. Everything isn't an all or nothing argument. It's not win-lose. You're not mind reading or predicting other people's thoughts. You're checking in. You're being an active listener. You're not fortune telling their behaviors based upon some perception which may be incorrect. What are those skills that you can apply so you're not attributing some kind of hostility to your audience? And indeed, how can you develop some of these preventative plans to overcome potential instability at a corporate and an individual level? So let's talk about this at a corporate level. If we talk about you as a sidekick, as a practitioner, if it is your job to help the main character, what does that mean? It really goes back to the airline industry analogy I presented earlier. The reason that you put your own oxygen mask first is so that you can help others. And how are you going to help others? So from a cultural perspective, there's some skills that are pulled from these three therapeutic practices. There's stop. There's just take a breather and figure out how to apply a more effective process. There's fair. There's active listening. There's engaging, not formulating responses, but actually listening. Taking your lumps and trying to tolerate these. When you do things wrong, which you need to be comfortable doing, how you survive a crisis without making it worse. How do you help your organization become resilient based upon your own self-reliance? There's also this concept of distress tolerance, which is it is your goal to help people. It is your goal to make sure that your organization has these strategies which are based upon active and real scenarios, not predictions that aren't necessarily based upon your organization's reality. There's also this concept of interpersonal effectiveness. A lot of what we do as security practitioners is based upon building relationships. And how do you do that in an effective manner is by being positive, making sure that you don't have a negative stigma, and that you're building programs based upon not just negative reinforcement, but also positive reinforcement. So as much as Admiral Grace Hopper states that the worst phrase in the English language is, we've always done it this way, that's fine. Accept it, move on, and talk about that as being a challenge to overcome. Express your feelings, but assert your authority to state that things have to change. You need to be confident. You need to negotiate and identify alternate solutions. You can't be just a naysayer, the guy who says no. You need to be the person who shows up and helps to put the toothpaste back in the tube, and the person who says yes, and here's how we're going to overcome these problems. Other strategies include identifying a particular circumstance, a repeated failure, what's called chain analysis. When you're negotiating variables or negotiating a particular path that you're trying to overcome, identify those variables, identify those links that are an opportunity for you to get ahead of a problem. Communication is one of those strategies, as I described earlier. Be fair, be listening all the time. There's also the willingness to embrace what people are telling you, to be mindful of everything being an opportunity, not necessarily a roadblock. It's just a speed bump. Mindfulness at an institutional organizational level means that your program is a 360. You're taking in feedback. It's based upon a balanced point of view, not something that necessarily was pulled right from the playbook of another industry or organization like NIST. It needs to be tailored, and it needs to be based upon an intersectionality of both reasonable behavior, emotional behavior, and some kind of understanding of your organization's history, or how they solve problems themselves. It can be a dialectic. It can be paradoxical. You can have a well-funded program, but perhaps it's not effective. You can be a starve for resources to get your job done, but maybe your program is quite effective because you're leveraging some of the practitioners that you work with, your colleagues in IT and in the business. These are strategies that you can apply at a corporate level to influence some of these maladaptive behaviors. So it's not reacting to distress by setting your hair on fire, or it's not identifying your strategic plan based upon a misunderstanding of how you solve problems in your industry or your corporation. There's also the sheer fact that, as I stated earlier, that you can't be effective in applying some of these strategies to help your organization if you first don't understand how you approach problems, how you can overcome the potential for burnout and fatigue. And there's also some strategies pulled from mindfulness and indeed dialectical behavioral therapy and ACT. So there's that intersectionality that I described earlier. There's the willingness to embrace change, the avoidance of being willful and trying to enforce change based upon a delusion of control or an illusion of control. You're trying to spend more time in that kind of wise mind space. There's also the willingness to look at self-care, to be compassionate to yourself, and to understand that you will fail. You need to be vulnerable. You need to be accepting of your human traits. You need to be less critical of yourself. You need to surround yourself with positive influences and be executing on a strategy to overcome some of those negative influences. People who are less accepting, people who are more critical, they've shown to be hostile. They've shown to be, controlling and very critical. That's okay in the short term, but on the other hand, it's self-destructive in the long term. So when you're more self-accepting, you're more willing to engage, you're more willing to support, and you're more willing to be transactional and kind of identify short-term measures that may be painful, but you're not trying to avoid them. You're embracing them. You have the ability to perceive and drive change, not just based upon one emotion, but across a spectrum of different cognitions. You're mindful. You're identifying these techniques to change behavior. You're in the moment. You're living, and you're embracing those behavioral changes, and you're being flexible and adaptable. There's also, for the record, a wellness village at DEF CON, so I certainly encourage you in the kind of tsunami that is DEF CON. If you're certainly in Las Vegas or even online, there's just so much information overload, and that somewhat represents our jobs as security practitioners. So just take that time and go to that wellness village and embrace it. Also, for the record, if you are wandering around DEF CON and you see me, more than willing to have a conversation and kind of drive into some of these thoughts, but I'll also be on the chat shortly after the conversation. So, acceptance therapy, it really thinks about this concept of radical acceptance, embracing the things that you can't change. It's being open to do things to be effective. It's certainly you're keeping your eye on the horizon. You have a goal and a strategy in mind. You're not deviating from your core principles, your morality, your ethicality. You're also looking at control as being both a positive and a negative. It can sometimes be a problem if you're trying to exert control, but it's based upon some illusion or delusion on what you can actually change, when instead you might need to partner with your colleagues. If you're trying to, as much as you're accountable for cybersecurity, maybe you don't have the authority in some domains. That really gets to the sidekick analogy that I brought up earlier. There's also just the fact that well-intentioned programs can sometimes go awry. Sometimes the cure can be worse than the complaint. So sometimes you need to look at a particular situation that you're in as being a road ahead. It's a path. It's short-term misery. Suffering is something that you need to endure, but it's your goal as a practitioner to make sure that from a corporation and individual perspective, it's temporary. You need to look at that. Things change, and you need to look at the fact that things get better. So wrapping up, coming to the end, there's kind of 4 key takeaways based upon those strategies at the corporate and the individual level. In summary, they're based upon MCBT, CBT, DBT, and ACT. That soup of letters really distills down to some of these core principles. So experience reality, live your life with your eyes wide open. Okay, commit to action, take effective steps to overcome your obstacles. If you're looking at everything as a roadblock, you're going to stop early. Definitely take action based upon your ability to execute change, regulate those behaviors that you can, kind of stop living in emotion land. It has its purpose, yes, but if it's the only stop on your way to overcome some of these challenges, you need to understand your motivations, why you're living in that one aspect of the Venn diagram, and how you get to acknowledge the logical actions and indeed the reality of your corporation, so that you spend a little bit more time in that kind of wise action. But also, for the record, I stated earlier, don't worry about being transparent or vulnerable. We will get things wrong. Failure isn't an end goal, but sometimes you learn more through failure, and it's something that you need to stem so you don't repeat it. But by that same measure, don't be the best kept secret. Speak to your team, speak to your colleagues about what's going on. In particular, if you have any mental health issues or challenges, please do talk to a therapist. Do surround yourself with positive influences. Your goal with these challenges is to apply these techniques, and they're proven. There's evidence behind them that they do help you overcome both your personal and cultural challenges. So, embrace that change. So I'm going to point out some of these other resources that you have to tap into. I'm going to be on the chat group. I'm going to be available if you have any questions in DEF CON. But if you're looking for other sources of information that led to this, there's the American Psychology Association, there's BrainFacts, there's PubMed, there's Medline Plus. There's lots of information on kind of these therapeutic cognitive behavioral therapy practices. There's the Society of Neuroscience. There's great content on Robert Sapolsky. And I certainly own a huge debt of gratitude to the Linehan School of Thought around DBT. So there's some references on here, indeed clickable links when you get the PDF. So that said, guys, that's the end of today's conversation. At least from a presentation perspective. I look forward to the chats and the questions that you have for me in the chat channel, or indeed on site in DEF CON. Thank you for your time here today. And, it's important to just, the main takeaway here being the reason that you apply your own oxygen mask first, is so that you can help others. So in order for you to be resilient and from an organizational perspective, you first need to look at your core self-reliance as well. And that's it, guys. Thank you very much and take care.